Good morning, everyone. My name is Alan Barr. I'm the managing partner of KPMG in Port Elizabeth, and since 2007, have been presenting the Global Automotive Survey here in South Africa. This year it's obviously been an unprecedented year with COVID-19. We were intending to release the global survey in Shanghai in April, but obviously with the advent of COVID-19, we had to postpone it, and therefore it was released only 3 weeks ago, the Global Automotive Survey, Executive Survey, and we're hoping to share some very useful insights this morning. Whilst people are still joining, just to let you know the course of events. So what we'll do is I'll introduce our guest speaker who will be presenting the survey, a colleague from Munich in Germany, Tobias Neujoks, and but then we'll have, that'll be about 30 minutes, and then we'll have some time for questions. So please use the chat box if you do have any questions regarding the survey or the panel. We'll give about 10 minutes for the questions on the survey specific, and then we will have a panel discussion. I'll introduce all the panelists, and we'll have a panel discussion on the state of the automotive industry in South Africa and how the impact of the global survey is going to have on South Africa and the South African industry, because it is so connected, in terms of the global automotive industry, in terms of where we are, South Africa. So it is quite critical. I would like to highlight that, in the past, the survey has been very well received by, people in South Africa, and a number of our clients have used the results of the survey to guide them in their strategies, to guide them in the thinking of what's happening globally, because the trends are very interesting. And despite COVID-19, we'll see later, but it has a slight change on the strategy, but not much. But I think what is very useful, and I would interact, we'll send out the full executive survey, post this event, but to highlight that it is an interactive survey, and it is highly useful if you, depending on your teams, can engage with the survey and drill down in terms of what is respondents from South Africa saying, or respondents from China or Europe. And my colleagues will demonstrate some of those aspects when we go through the survey. So just as an introduction to my colleague, Tobias, he's been with KPMG since 2012. He's a partner in our German practice, leading the strategy part of the business. I think it's important to note he's not an auditor, which I think many people, think KPMG is mainly on audit side. So Tobias is not an auditor. He was in Siemens, head of strategy there in the sales operation. He's had over 20 years of experience, and at the moment really heading up the strategy side in the automotive space for EMA, and guiding a number of automotive companies and retail businesses, industrial manufacturing on the strategy and what is happening in the future, and taking it from there. So without any further ado, I'd like to hand over to Tobias. Thank you so much for being part of this presentation today. It's great to get someone that's been involved heavily with the survey, and to give us in South Africa some insights of what the results are. So I hope you all enjoy the morning. We're going to stick to the timelines and be finished by 11:30. But thank you once again for joining, and we hope you look forward to the discussion. Over to you, Tobias.
Alan, thank you very much. It's a pleasure for me to join that webinar and share some of the key results we discovered during our survey this year, which was somehow untypical because it started with prior to COVID and it ended post COVID. So quite interesting times. For the ones who have not joined previous webinars on the Global Automotive Executive Survey of KPMG, our Global Automotive Executive Survey journey has been an adventure since 21 years. In 2012, we discovered the increasing significance of non-asset-based players, which is now since years a reality. In 2014, personalized mobility and the Internet of Everything became a key theme, long before we really have seen it in the market and really materializing. 2016, mobile connectivity and the value of customer data we are discussing since that time. And 2018, it became obvious that the auto industry as we know it will not remain. And now, 2020, we actually say goodbye to one global market and recognize increasing localization. In the next 20 minutes, I will basically guide you through the main chapters which you see at the top of the slide. So we will talk about the mega trends and then about the view of executives and consumers on product, customer, ecosystem. And at the end, we will also highlight some findings from the post-COVID crisis or from the COVID-19 crisis, which surprised us during the finalization of the survey. But let me start with the obvious automotive key trends. Battery electric vehicles, connectivity and digitalization, fuel cell EVs, and plug-in hybrids have established themselves as the most important key trends in the industry since 2017. But this technology-driven agenda got interrupted. COVID-19 is now shifting the industry's focus from technological development to a more survival, cash-driven, and operationally focused agenda. And thirdly, one global answer to the trends in the automotive industry does not reflect reality any longer. E.g., decoupling of regional blocks and the emergence of new behaviors and customer demands force auto companies to develop independent regional strategies for customers and markets alike. These regional shifts do lead to significant shifts in production capacity. So 76% of executives agree that by 2030, less than 5% of global car production will occur in Western Europe. This is a 9% increase in voter share since last year. But it is not only this regional shift in production capacity. We will witness a variety of other localized shifts for different technologies, markets, and applications, assisted by an as yet undetermined degree of deglobalization following COVID-19. Just this week, SEAT in Spain gathered 60 of its main suppliers in a virtual meeting to explain that it will be committed to increasing the level of localization of components in Spain, to shorten the global supply chain and boost environmental and financial sustainability at the same time. SEAT expresses that this will include investments in new technologies to improve competitiveness and adapt to electrification, the connected car, and Industry 4.0. But this proliferation of regional and local trends is not only the effect of customer demand and company policies. 83% of executives agree that regulators and industry policies are driving technological agendas. Subsidy strategies and tax breaks will be essential instruments. A good example are the very different CO2 regulations in China, the European Union, and the United States, which already force car manufacturers and exhaust system providers into different local strategies and technology roadmaps. And this brings us to the overarching super trend of sustainability. almost all executives see sustainability as a key differentiator. But on the consumer side, only 17% still do not recognize this at all. KPMG supports the belief that the industry would benefit from a cradle-to-grave sustainability rating. And OEMs like Volkswagen, with their S for sustainability rating, entered this path already in summer last year. But it is a long way. Criteria for classifying a product as sustainable are still not precise and transparent enough for customers to truly support their decision-making. Last but not least, raw materials become another determinant for a country's vehicle strategy. 73% of execs agree that countries' mineral resources dictate the country's preferred powertrain technology. What could this mean for South Africa? While electricity supply is just keeping the balance with electricity demand, the country is dependent on petroleum supplies. While it is most probably too early for a large-scale deployment of electric vehicles now, the need for higher ICE efficiency through new technology developments and lighter materials is quite evident. And overall, the resource constraints for battery raw materials raise doubts on the perspective of a mass deployment of fully electric vehicles. Efficiency savings through economies of scale in battery production will not outweigh increases in demand for battery raw materials. And this might result in increased battery prices in the mid to long term. On the product dimension, one of the key questions is still about the future of the combustion engine and the dominating vehicle architecture. There will be no clear single investment strategy as long as raw materials and industry politics have a country-specific or regional route. For the first time in the history of our survey, executives think that by 2030, the largest share of vehicles will not be powered by an ICE powertrain. Fuel cell, battery, plug-in hybrids, and ICEs will coexist. While in Western Europe, OEM executives clearly focus their development on battery electric vehicles by 83% and plug-in hybrids 80%, North American OEMs executives tend to be willing to invest more in further developing ICEs by 89%. Consumers, on the other hand, continue to favor hybrids grounded in the ICE technology. Autonomy readiness has been the other key product question which is still under dispute. Both executives and consumers believe that fully autonomous vehicles are further being implemented than originally predicted. As in last year's survey, global results show that consumers expect to see fully self-driving cars on roads sooner than executives. However, adoption of autonomous vehicles from 2030 onwards is now clearly the most voted answer for both executives and consumers worldwide. But this data is up for question. More than 1 in 5 executives don't believe in the adoption of autonomous vehicles before 2040. A major concern here is safety. 77% of execs agree that mixed traffic between autonomous and non-autonomous vehicles will lead to severe safety issues and liability claims. We at KPMG Automotive Institute believe that autonomous vehicles will only be a truly successful in isolated regions, so-called islands of autonomy, where driving behavior is converging and each vehicle follows the same set of rules, grounded in a so-called bionic swarm intelligence. When it comes to the wider deployment of electric and fuel cell drives, providing a hassle-free and a seamless charging experience is essential for general electric vehicle adoption. 84% of consumers see the responsibility for charging infrastructure with OEMs. The other key factor of wider deployment of electric vehicle is price. Purchase price remains the biggest entry barrier for consumers for electric vehicles. Consumers still seem to focus primarily on the purchase price of a car and widely neglect total cost of ownership advantages offered by e-mobility and other mobility services and subscription models. And range is the joint second most important factor in this year's result. This may become the most important factor in the future if prices for battery electric vehicles continue to fall due to higher production volumes. An interesting outcome has been the view who will become the top leader in e-mobility, where actually BMW made the race prior to Tesla. This is surprising in particular for a German, as it has been Volkswagen who made last year the most aggressive announcement on electric vehicle adoption in their product roadmap. So we are curious to see how this race will end. In regard to fuel cell, 84% of executives think that fuel cell will experience their breakthrough in industrial transportation first. This is a 5% increase compared to 2019. When we now move to the customer perspective, customer centricity is in the center of all discussions. Still, OEMs can defend their lead in the battle for valuable customer relationships. Nearly half of all executives and consumers agree that OEMs will also be closest to the customer in 5 years' time. But current opinions differ on the second position. While executives have placed substantial importance on suppliers, rising from 17% to 24% in just 1 year, ICT companies play a more crucial role for consumers. Those players who rethink user-friendliness offer individually customized services and business models like concierge services for premium customers, fleet and a new type of purchase and subscription models will likely move into the fast lane. The tech world, with their in-home voice assistants and on-demand IT services desk within stores, has already provided some customer retention techniques, and it's up to the OEMs to pick up speed by creating these proactive personal assistants in applications such as for new leasing contracts, for finding cheaper insurance, for predictive warning system, or personalized route selection. Obviously, all tailored to individual user patterns. Whoever is best at putting themselves in the shoes of the customer will likely take over the future customer relationship. And I think it's a real good question if at the end OEMs or even suppliers can really make that race. If you look at China, according to Chinese consumers, ICT companies are already close to take over the lead in customer relationship from OEMs. That's 26% compared to 30%. In such countries where prominent ICT players have a more dominant role and shape daily life, the digital ecosystem thinking is becoming dominant over the car brand. By contrast, in Western Europe, where no dominant ICT player are triggering ecosystem thinking, retailers play a much more decisive role for the customer. And this brings us to the question on the retail and aftermarket concept of the future. While we are further from online purchasing than expected, only 1 in 5 global consumers say that they will not buy a car online. More than 60% of execs believe that the number of physical retail outlets will decrease between 20 to 30% globally. But it is not only the pure reduction in the number of retail outlets. Many executives believe that there is no way around reshaping existing outlets and the entire aftermarket structure. The challenge is the entire transformation of the support and aftermarket concept along the increasing share of software-driven developments in vehicles. At this stage, I would now like to make an excursion and share with you how one can use the online platform of this year's executive survey to generate insights on a particular topic of interest. And this is open to all of you. I would like to use the topic Retail of the Future, one of the sub-chapters of the Customer Value chapter, for this short demonstration of the interactive capabilities of this year's Automotive Executive Survey. As you can see, the link has taken me directly to the sub-chapter Retail of the Future on our online platform. Along the top of the page, you can navigate between the 4 main chapters of the study: Megatrends, Product Value, Customer Value, and Ecosystem Value. On the left-hand side of the page, you can see the sub-chapters of the selected main chapter, in this case, consisting of customer centricity, seamless multimodal mobility, and Retail of the Future. Each subchapter can furthermore be easily navigated using the displayed quick menu items. I will focus on the topic of retail transformation for this demonstration. I can quickly get to the desired section by clicking on the associated quick menu link. Like in most sections of the survey, this section uses the result of a survey question as the basis of discussion. All survey results are displayed in the form of interactive embedded Tableau dashboards. I will now scroll down to and load the relevant dashboard for the topic of retail transformation. For this topic, our executive respondents were asked to indicate their level of agreement with the following hypothesis. The only viable option for physical retail outlets will be the transformation into becoming service factories or used car hubs. New car sales will be processed via more digital channels. In the top right-hand corner of every dashboard, you will find either an executive, consumer, or executive versus consumer comparison icon to indicate the respondent group for the given question. In this case, we can clearly see that the only executives who asked this particular question. Underneath the question and icon is a row of drop-down filters, with which you can filter the displayed data. All responses from executive questions, for example, can be filtered by regional cluster, country of origin, stakeholder group, job title, and company revenue segment. Underneath this reset button, you can see the number of respondents you currently have selected based on your filters. The responses to the above question can be seen under the row of filter options. In this default view, one can quickly see that there was over 80% agreement, 32% absolutely and 49% partially agree with the hypothesis amongst all executives globally this year. The thinner bar shows the results from the previous year as comparison. In this case, one can see that there has been a slight shift in answers from partially disagree to undecided since last year. Underneath the overall results, one can use the deep dive view to generate a segmented view based on either region, stakeholder type, job title, or company revenue segment. As a default for this particular question, the deep dive has been set to segment by regional cluster. The colors of the displayed bubbles in the deep dive section match the colors of the bar chart. Partially green, for example, is the middle blue in both the top and bottom half of the dashboard. Moving from left to right, we see the results by region. South Africa, for example, falls into the region Rest of World on the right end of the graph. Also, slight differences by region can be seen. There seems to be a general high level of agreement among executives globally. As I am perhaps particularly interested in the opinion of dealers globally with respect to the hypothesis of retail transformation, I can now use the filters at the top of the dashboard to reduce my respondent data set to contain dealers only. At this point, you can also see the list of available stakeholders to filter by, which cover the entire ecosystem. I have now reduced my data set to only contain the responses of dealers globally. And as we can see, both the overall global results in the bar chart as well as the regional segmented results in the deep dive have changed as expected. Insightful is the deep dive view for dealer opinions. One can now clearly see that there are large regional differences in the opinions of dealers with respect to retail transformation. While Western regions are less confident, in particular Asian dealers and dealers in the rest of the world region, which includes South Africa, are very convinced that physical retailers have to transform radically. Let's now switch back to the PowerPoint presentation and continue the overview on the overall findings. One other item which was driving customer perspective is the increasing ask for seamless multimodal mobility. There is no one and only global mobility concept. Mobility concepts must be designed on the basis of their application for cities and rural areas and must be closely geared to customer demand. More than 80% of global executives agree. It will be interesting to monitor the impact of COVID-19 on mobility concepts. The crisis will lead to much tighter budget management and hopefully total cost of ownership orientation among consumers. Consumers will weigh up physical integrity risk against budgetary restrictions. In such a time, making contracts more flexible, e.g. through subscription models, could help customers to overcome uncertainty. These models could be particularly helpful in times when total cost of ownership or total cost of usage model dominate a customer's mobility decision. We at KPMG's Automotive Institute are of the opinion that post-COVID-19 uncertainty demands solutions for customers that allow for much more flexibility in contractual commitments. Let's now take a broader view on the entire automotive ecosystem, starting with the capital market perspective. The market capitalization of the top 15 mobile tech and web digital companies is more than 5 times higher than the market capitalization of the top 50 traditional automotive OEMs and suppliers. Means the financing power of OEMs and suppliers is marginalized compared to the tech players. Due to tough post-COVID-19 market conditions and even greater complexity in the automotive industry, with huge investments into new technologies, this new survey continues to reward what it has for years. It is a misconception that traditional mobility players can act alone and still cover the entire value chain single-handed. Automotive players currently exist in ecosystems that act as a living matrix. They should not risk not investing and find themselves stranded on a desert island. On the contrary, automotive players need to invest in an ecosystem which supports them and will help them to survive at a later point in time. The COVID-19 crisis is now even forcing, in particular, auto suppliers to make a choice rather quickly and close or divest some activities due to liquidity constraints. And we anticipate an accelerated consolidation amongst automotive suppliers, but also amongst OEMs. But this is not necessarily a bad thing, as competition is back. In contrast to last year, competition between automotive manufacturers and ICT companies is increasing. And the only way is to build stronger automotive industry players to compete with the players from the ICT world. The transformation from ownership to shared use turns the way we do business upside down. Market success is being redefined from measuring units sold to miles driven. Products must be adapted to application needs, usage patterns, and expected service life, while over-engineering must be actively avoided. However, with the growth of mobility services, debt levels are expected to increase, and with them, the importance of financial services will rise. Nearly 3 in 4 executives confirm this view. When we look at data supremacy, executives and consumers are not aligned with respect to whom consumers would trust most with their data. While customers clearly say that they want to have control over their data, OEMs still believe that they would be trusted to own the value of the data. However, sources of value from data is still an open race. E.g., more than 40% of all executives agree that monetizing data is best done with safety-oriented applications, such as car-to-X communication. But all agree that the industry is shifting from a push market, where units sold is the main performance KPI, towards a much more user-centric pull market, where consumer data like miles driven or information on driving behavior are the raw material for data-driven business models. Let me conclude now with some views on the impact of COVID-19. We believe that it is essential to acknowledge COVID-19 as a global wave movement, which must be assessed simultaneously from a production as well as a sales footprint perspective. Wave management models capturing the time delay within supply and demand chains remain essential. This is a development that we have already seen with the SARS disease, but which began to decline after the initial wave. Also, COVID-19 crisis has led to fundamental changes in demand, with the effect of much deeper systematic recession. Sales teams should not be laid off. Instead, companies should focus intensively on managing customer relationships and digital demand and providing flexible, low upfront offerings. We believe that there will be long-term effects on public transport. People will use public transport more selectively and are willing to spend more money to feel safe. China's panic-like fear of disease and fever has led to an increasing demand in the high-end and low-end sectors already. Liquidity is key in these times post-COVID, so companies with strong liquidity can take advantage of the opportunities in new partnerships that lie ahead, including the detection of M&A targets. As I am personally a member of the deal advisory team in Germany, after a steep decrease for sure in March, April, we already see a very high interest again on the buy side towards automotive and related targets, in particular coming from China. And it's already been announced by Xi Jinping in China that investing in this type of industry in the post-COVID world is one of the new paradigms of the new five-year plan in China. Differentiating between cultures becomes also more essential. While China and the US tend to have spending cultures, consumers in Japan and Germany are still rather reluctant to spend. The CO2 targets will be tested, and the widespread adoption of e-mobility will depend on high government subsidies. Without these, e-mobility will only be able to survive in certain application areas. And last but not least, we are convinced that there's only one way forward, and that is to redefine competition towards industry-wide co-competition. This means to collectively ensure supply chain stability alongside a global readjustment to a reduced demand structure channeled through digital demand management and service factories. If you just have a final look, and then I think we basically will share that amongst you. I will just give you a hint on the key highlights of this year's surveys. So we asked 1,100 executives, more than 2,000 consumers, and we integrated truck manufacturers. 50% of the executives have been at CEO and C-level. You have a mobile version of all that. You have the interactive version, which we just demonstrated to you. And we have an improved search function, which hopefully leads you to the areas which are most interesting for you. So thank you very much for giving me the time to share some key highlights. And now I'm happy to hand over to Alan again as our host.
Thanks, Tobias. Really appreciate you giving us some insight. If there are any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat box for Tobias. I think one of the interesting things we're also seeing in South Africa is the people moving away from public transport as well. I think we saw an upsurge in new car sales in June and July for people, new first-time buyers, similar to China, where people are trying to reduce their reliance on public transport. So, that's also interesting to see. But I think the other key message just to highlight for everyone as well is that there's no clear answer. You look at the responses from South Africa, it's very different to what we're seeing around the rest of the world in terms of where the focus is. And you look at North America versus China, as you mentioned, Tobias, everyone's focusing on a different powertrain in terms of where they think the future will hold, right? So I think that's the challenge in terms of managing it from a South African perspective. So yeah, like I said, please post your questions. I'd now like to ask the rest of the panel to join me. I will introduce each one if they can put their videos on. We got a wide range of stakeholders, and I think it's going to be for an interesting discussion and debate. We already had one as we were preparing for the session on electric vehicles and ICE and etc. And I had to stop them and let's keep the conversation, for the webinar. So I think it was excellent. So what I'm going to be just doing is I'll introduce each panel and then, just pose them a question and they'll give some response, and then we'll open it up for broader discussion. So first I'd like to welcome Renee Mukliel. He's the Executive Director of NARCAM. And Renee, thanks very much for joining us this morning. And, if you see what's happening globally in terms of the automotive industry, what is the impact on South Africa, which is obviously a key component in job creation and technology investment, etc., and really part of that aspect. And similarly, you know, a lot of the component manufacturers have an arm in the aftermarket, right? So what's your view and the impact of what's happening globally on the space?
Morning. Thanks, Alan. Thanks to KPMG for having myself and Narcam as part of this discussion. A really interesting topic, and I think, like you said, lots of it forward-looking, and there's strong debates and points for and against a lot of what we're speaking about today. I think in terms of what you posed at me, South Africa is obviously an interesting example in that we sit with pockets of let's say developed market preference and production systems. I mean, we've got a very strong and well-defined production system for automotives in South Africa, in the midst of what's kind of a broad-based sort of developing market characteristic, both within our borders, outside of the big metro areas, and then across the wider continental region. I think if we come back to lots of what was presented in the study, and impact or kind of perspective for South Africa, there were a couple of findings that stood out for me, and I suppose are interesting in the context of the space of component manufacturers and what it does for our local system. The points on mobility. I think mobility is increasingly becoming top of mind, especially in the South African space. I mean, if anything, if you think about this COVID situation that we've all just gone through, it's forced a complete rethink on consumer perspectives regarding mobility. Just ourselves as consumers, our own personal car usage has dropped during the hard lockdown, even as we started to come out of lockdown, not using personal vehicles as much as we used to. I mean, interesting. Just yesterday, I had a take-a-lot delivery being dropped off at home by a furniture removal truck. You know, one of these medium-sized trucks that you can do house moving with. And they obviously consolidated deliveries as opposed to using a single car for the delivery. So in my mind, I'm thinking mobility. What does that mean? Future Uber vehicle purchases, are they going to be more VW Caravelle as opposed to a VW Polo? Is the commercial vehicle space going to grow more than passenger vehicles, which is kind of different to what we thought of in a pre-COVID scenario? If so, what's the impact in terms of the different powertrain technologies that we're talking about? I think I saw earlier in the slides the preference for fuel cell EVs tending towards the commercial vehicle space. Is this something that us as component manufacturers now need to start thinking about as we look at particular niches of powertrain technologies that we want to retread or position ourselves for the future? I think from a stakeholder perspective, this argument is no different to other wider stakeholder discussions we have had in a policy space over the past few years. I mean, we talk about SA being positioned as a base for one-ton pickups, where we have some scale or volume. Should we now start thinking about that in a particular EV technology space that is pushed towards commercial vehicle production? I think these are the kind of things that as stakeholders and players in the policy space, we have to grapple around. And then I saw a stat in one of the documents around the point about fuel cell EVs being top of mind for South African executives. You know, in my own sense, is this could be a fairly big opportunity for South Africa, both from a manufacture and export of component, let's call it an ecosystem. The value chain in South Africa already exists. If you think about the kind of companies that are involved in the fuel cell EV space, tend to be, from a multinational perspective, housed in the same structures as the quotas of our CATCON products being done in South Africa. So I don't know, it may even be in some bizarre way that from a South African perspective, we benefit from production trends in both EV and ICE And let's talk about these as individual kind of niches. My sense is that as long as the policy and the business support infrastructure is put in place to allow such companies to move as they continue in the CATCON space, but to start moving into the fuel cell EV component space, that could be a really exciting opportunity for us. Just in terms of some of what you've spoken about in terms of the aftermarket suppliers, my own short-term view is that South Africa and I think the wider African space will remain internal combustion driven until some fairly big infrastructures come into play. And when we talk about aftermarket producers, so component manufacturers in South Africa, I think we've got to understand that those component technologies are not exclusive to a powertrain of any sort. I mean, if you let's just use very basic examples: glass, tires, suspension products, sound deadening products. That's the kind of stuff that you use, whether it's an EV powertrain or whether it's ICE. So I don't think there's an immediate danger of losing production, whether we're in an ICE dominant or an EV dominant environment globally. For me, the fact that South Africa is so integrated as a global autos destination, and we've got the breadth and depth of multinational production, both from an OE and a tier one perspective. The investment in technology for the different variants or specifications will follow the market. And again, it's a benefit of having the globalized production network that we do. And I think we really, as South Africans, from whichever space we are, we've got to treasure this production environment that we have and ensure that we do all that we can to support and help it grow, irrespective of what the predominant vehicle powertrain technology may be globally. There's a real opportunity, like I said in the context earlier on, for South Africa to become a hub of component production. And again, even as we go into the EV space, the guys who are doing spring production in South Africa could easily become big exporters of those kind of suspension products globally, wherever the EVs are being assembled. If we think about the kind of volume cuts that have come about as a result of COVID, I mean, it's no surprise. The South African vehicle market was down 30% year-on-year, Q1, even before we got to COVID. So I think that's almost, if you look at the most recent NAAMSA sales figures that were released, I think more than 60% decline year-on-year. So we've got to think about wider vehicle or product markets. Once you have a shock in the system, like what COVID-19 has done for us, kind of widening our product mix or our export product mix gives us, I suppose, some traction in both traditional and new markets, whatever the technology may be. If we think about aftermarket and what happens in the aftermarket outside of production, the actual servicing or retail space, if we only talk about EVs, let's agree that there has got to be some greater emphasis on skills development in that particular area. I don't think it's been something that has been driven very hard in our country to date. But the fact is, as our urban mobility needs and preferences change, we've got to have a skills base that can react to that. But again, I think the bigger driver is going to be that shift in mobility and what aftermarket players are going to be doing to ensure their offerings match that mobility shift. I think I'm going to close off with a really important point, and that in a South African context, new market development is key. We have for a long time almost have had an insulated market preference outside of our traditional export markets in the West, whether it's been the UK or the EU. We haven't done, I suppose, hard yards in helping build a regional market that is at the level that it can absorb some of the automotive products that are found in the South African environment, whether it's vehicle or even component production. So the work that's being done by different stakeholders to create nodes of production across Africa is really important. And we start talking about African industrialization, not only from creating a consumer base. When you develop these industrial economies, you have a spin-off effect in terms of the consumer's appetite for the kind of products that we produce. But it's not only about vehicles coming out of South Africa, it's also providing some consolidation and definition of aftermarket opportunities. But also it's really important to prevent that nascent market from becoming a dumping ground. And it's already been a dumping ground of some sort for used and grey vehicles. And that then tends to have an impact on segmented and uncontrolled aftermarket characteristics. I know one of my members always tells me that his biggest competitor in the African aftermarket space is himself. You know, it's their product in a box that was not made by them, kind of thing, if you understand what I'm saying. So I think interestingly, as more Western cities and countries start phasing out EVs, if we come back to lots of what we spoke about earlier, you've got to ask where are all those ICE vehicles that are sitting in those cities right now likely to find themselves if we don't get a handle on this used kind of grey situation. So I think, again, from a stakeholder perspective, that's where we spend a lot of our time thinking, how do we drive industrial economies to support South Africa's own objectives. I think I'm going to stop there. I've kind of touched on a fair bit of what was raised earlier. Thanks.
Thanks, Renee. Thanks very much. And the point on mobility is very important, and hence we've invited our mobility lead, Dex Machida, but I'll get to you shortly, Dex. I'd also like to welcome Winston Jordan. Winston is the MD of Grid Cars. Grid Cars is doing a lot in the EV space, electric vehicle space, in terms of infrastructure in the country. And I think they were a founding member of the Electric Vehicle Association, Industry Association in South Africa. So, Winston, from your perspective, what's happening globally, obviously there's this massive shift towards electric vehicles and new powertrains. Your thoughts on what has been presented this morning, as well as what is the landscape in South Africa in terms of electric vehicles and the demand therefore?
Good morning, Alan, and thank you. And thank you for the invite. It's wonderful to be working with people like yourselves and discussing these things as we discovered before the presentation even started. Looking at the Global Automotive Executive Summary, I think there's certainly a lot in it. So, and we've been through the whole presentation now, but to highlight just a few points for me, it's exciting to see that there's still a strong focus on connectivity and the digital technology, because I think while it has dropped a little bit over the years, I think the idea is that it's still a dominant part of that industry. It's still a big thing. It's going to change a lot of what happens with things like autonomous vehicles, mobility as a service, and through ticketing systems, the different ways that we're going to see mobility present itself, whether that's public or private transport systems. I thought there was one very interesting statement where it said only 1 in 5 customers would not buy their car online. I think it would have been far better served if we stated that 80% of people would buy their car online. And I think that's something that the automotive industry needs to really take note of, that only 1 in 5 would not be a customer in an online space. And I think we are seeing that trend already in terms of how you purchase your vehicle, without naming the manufacturer. If you want to buy a particular vehicle of a very popular brand, you've got to go to their website. You're going to configure your car there. If you don't want to do it yourself, when you get to the dealership, the dealer will sit down and go through the website with you and configure and select the components of the vehicle. So this is absolutely where we're going to be seeing the technology go. Also, it's really interesting to see the changes in view of whether it's an EV technology or a hydrogen fuel cell. I think what's quite important is that we must remember to engage in the right debate. We're talking about EVs versus hydrogen fuel cells. Well, actually, it's not the right debate. It's batteries versus hydrogen fuel cells, because all hydrogen vehicles are already EVs. So all of the technology we talk around about EV, it's exactly the technology inside of a hydrogen vehicle. Unless we're talking hydrogen combustion, which I don't think anybody is. I think they're all talking hydrogen through fuel cell technology. So the debate is the future lying within a battery or a fuel cell, not the rest of the vehicle. And I think we need to understand that clearly as we look at markets and at what components and role we can play, we mustn't make the mistake of arguing the wrong points. As we see the introduction of electric vehicle technology, what's going to happen, and now electric vehicle, I include hydrogen in that statement, and that is we are going to see a massive drop in operational expenses of those vehicles. But the fuel is a lot cheaper, especially if it's electric, pure on a battery, versus hydrogen, slightly more expensive. But the fuel is a lot cheaper, and the operational and running costs, the cars are much more reliable. So you're going to have a lot less maintenance, and that is going to result in a lot less dealerships. And unfortunately, on the aftermarket side, probably a lot less components. Certainly, some of these components are a lot more expensive. So I think some of the balances will balance out. But, and the study did bring that out as well, is to say that they do believe that 30% of the dealers will be lost over the next 10 years, or there'll be 30% less dealers over that period. And I think those, for me, are the key highlights of what that summary puts out. To just give you some idea about what's happening in South Africa, you know, a lot of people may not realize that right now, all of the major highways, and if I talk major, I'm going to say N1, N2, N3, and N4. So those, the first four Ns, all have EV chargers within 200 kilometers of each other along those highways. So based on that statement, you can drive literally from Johannesburg to Cape Town with an electric vehicle today. Not maybe in the future, it is available. In fact, I'm pretty sure if I go and look at the network now, because we've got a long weekend coming up, we are going to see people charging at distant and further away charging stations. You know, last weekend alone, we saw one of our biggest peaks in terms of usage of the network. So there were people driving from Durban down to Cape Town, there were people driving the Garden route, and there were people driving on the N4. So we are seeing this adoption and take-up of electric vehicle technology. South Africa, because we were late into this industry, we are actually got an advantage, because we really saw all the mistakes that were made in Europe around how the different systems should fit together. So if you look at the mobility systems around charge point management, clearinghouses, billing systems, roaming systems, all of those systems evolved in different ways. There were pockets, it needs to work like this, no, it must work like that. And there were debates and arguments. We've seen the winning scenario, and we've been able to, over the last 3 or 4 years in South Africa, implement that. So right now, we have a solid charge point management system here in South Africa. We have good billing and management systems. We have a clearinghouse that deals with payments. And we have roaming systems that allow people to roam between networks. So a single card, if it's a card issued by BMW, can roam onto charging stations by Jaguar or by somebody else. And that's a really, really important phase of moving forward with that technology. Again, as we start looking at where the component technology will go, the debate is really, again, not so much around the rest of the components as was stated earlier. A lot of the components are the same. The debate is really around electric motor versus petrol motor. Now, there are a few things that will change because of that, and that is a petrol motor is a bit more noisy, it's a bit more dirty, and therefore electric motors don't need those support systems to be part of that. But the rest of the vehicle is mostly the same, and those component sides will still be supported in the same way. In closing, to maybe just explore just where electric vehicles came from, and that is, it started as early as 1850. So electric vehicles were certainly some of the first vehicles, just after steam vehicles in terms of transport systems, and they dominated until about 1910. Price, availability of cheap fuel, and convenience were the three drivers that resulted in the demise of electric vehicles around 1910. Price, fossil fuel vehicles were cheaper. Availability of cheap fuel, well, was discovered in Texas. And based on that, it became the easy and accessible fuel. Convenience, well, the electric motor contributed to that by actually providing a starter motor for petrol motors, which made it very convenient because you didn't need to crank it anymore. So, but that said, these will be the drivers of the adoption of new electric vehicles going forward. Price, they will be cheaper than fossil fuel vehicles. They will have cheaper availability of fuel. Right now, if I drive an electric vehicle, my cost of fuel dropped by about 6 times cheaper when I moved from from petrol to electric. So I went from having a 4,000 Rand a month fuel bill to having a 600-700 Rand electricity bill. And these are the drivers that will drive the adoption of new EVs going forward. On the local market side, I completely agree with what was said, in that we really need to see a creation and a drive of a local market. The biggest inhibitor in that today in South Africa is the taxes. So we pay more tax on the electric vehicle than you pay on a petrol vehicle. We're the only country in the world that does that. That is going to result in less sales, and less sales will result in local markets not being able to adapt or adopt and move into this technology space, because OEMs will not come and establish an electric vehicle factory in South Africa. They would much rather go and do it in Ethiopia, Ghana, I can't remember the others, but there's 3 or 4 African countries that have had EV strategies in place with the big OEMs. South Africa is not one of them. And this is primarily because we haven't created a conducive environment that allows these technologies to flourish and grow, that people can build the technology around that. Thank you.
Thanks, Winston. And I think you touch on a couple of important points that come through in our survey. Number one, the regulations or the regulatory bodies does drive what vehicles are going to be taking place, as opposed to customer demand. You mentioned the taxes as an example. I think the other point you made, which was highlighted by Tobias, is that, you know, it's not going to be about governance putting in infrastructure. It's going to be about the OEMs, similar to the Tesla model, that if they're going to drive electric vehicles or whatever fuel stations, they're going to have to do the investment as opposed to, you know, the government. So, you know, thanks for sharing and just making the reality of what's taking place in South Africa aligned with what's happening in the rest of the world. But I agree with you. I think if we can follow and learn the mistakes made elsewhere, but they at the same time, absolutely, you know, making sure we don't fall too far behind. But as in my view, as well as mentioned by Renee, I think there is an opportunity for us to take advantage of all these different opportunities that are out there globally, especially in the niche space. You know, we're not used to doing large runs. No, but thanks very much, and we'll get on to some more questions shortly. No, Dexter, in terms of mobility, I mean, there's obviously a lot of changing needs. So just for everyone, know, Dex is our Mobility 2030 lead for KPMG in South Africa, connected to the global team. And obviously mobility, as we mentioned by our previous 2 panelists, is quite high on the agenda. And we've just seen, I suppose, during COVID, how important that is, and even the use of a car. I know some people that are now reducing their family vehicles to 1. They don't need 2 cars necessarily anymore. But also the changes in the next generation, you know, the disruption in technology, the increase of the likes of an Uber and those type of, your thoughts on mobility and what's happening in South Africa?
Thank you very much, Alan. So maybe one point that I'd really like to highlight in regards to the conversation that I'm involved in is that I'm looking at electrical vehicles, autonomous vehicles, and mobility as a service. And we're trying to understand from a global perspective, what does that really mean for South Africa? And one of the important trends, and this is something I just saw 2 days ago as a news article, and it's to do with one of our trading partners, the UK. For those of you who do not know, the UK happens to be one of our largest trading partners when it comes to the automotive conversation. Now, the interesting article that I see spoke to the fact that for a specific period in the UK this year, 10% of all vehicles sold were electrified vehicles. Now, if we think about the fact that give or take around 50% of the volumes of exports related to vehicles goes to the UK, and 10% of their sales is now electrified vehicles, which is only expected to increase. There is a conversation that we need to start thinking about here around, so what is South Africa's role in the global supply chain, and how are we going to be ensuring that our relevance in that supply chain is going to be sustained? So I just thought that's maybe a good starting point to kick off the conversation. Now, when we look at our industry domestically, a very small portion is tailored specifically for sale in country versus a large portion is actually going out of our country as well. So when we look at vehicle demand, it's not simply about how many vehicles are being sold either to residential or commercial users, but we also do have to think about the global market. And so from those type of perspectives, when we first look at the global markets, we know what the drivers are. There's a whole sustainability conversation happening where a lot of the European countries are getting into the bandwagon. Same thing with China as well. US to an extent, but not so much. But the overall trend globally is that electrification is definitely on the agenda. But this is also very region specific. And a very good example I can give you in this instance is Japan, which is considered as one of the, a really first world industrialized nations, doesn't necessarily have a lot of EVs on the roads. The reason for that is there's more hybrid electric vehicles on the roads. So they're still preferring to utilize petrol vehicles, but it does have a hybrid drivetrain on it, which gives it that extra efficiency. If you look at Europe, for example, the BEV, the battery electric vehicle conversation is where it's really pushing ahead. But if we look at the African continent, it is still primarily either petrol or diesel. And it is because of the fact that, and it will highlight in the GAES, but also by some of our earlier panelists, is that the enabling environment isn't there right now. Now, that's also another important point to highlight in regards to the uptake of electric vehicles. From a South African perspective, the average purchasing price of a vehicle is around 200,000 Rand. So if we look at some of the cheaper electric vehicles that's available globally today, they don't really hit that price point. So I guess from a South African perspective specifically, at least my view on it is the short to the medium term, I only see a very, very slight increase in uptake of electrical vehicles because of the fact that the price parity conversation really hasn't hit the point where it makes sense for South Africans, but also at the same time, again, the enabling environment where the taxes aren't really helping. Although the charging infrastructure has gotten really good. And Winston, I did see that GridCars has put a lot of charging stations down. I saw one specifically in Sandton, the one that's being done with Diego Land Rover, which was pretty cool. But again, I think from an overall vehicle demand perspective, domestic demand for electric vehicles, I don't see rising too quickly, but the global demand is where the conversation really lies. So from a South African market perspective, we do have to think about how do we start catering for that global demand to ensure that our supply chain is going to be still relevant. As for the domestic side, because I still do foresee that, at least for the short to the medium term, petrol and diesel, maybe more petrol because of all the emissions conversation that's happening, is going to be the primary driver. Although, again, because of what has happened with COVID, the new vehicle sales is where it's taking a knock. And the whole grey import conversation is where a lot of African countries are focusing on right now, meaning I don't really see us being able to sell all of these new vehicles that we are creating within the country. So now the conversation starts becoming, what do we need to really start doing as South Africa for us to try to increase vehicle sales or even component sales? It is going to be a mixture of looking at our global markets and seeing what our trading partners are doing so we can try to cater for that market. And then perhaps using the time that's available to us to transition towards adopting some of those market trends, such as the electrification conversation. So again, I don't want to spend too much time on this conversation, but I think the important trends that we do need to really think about from the increasing our overall pie or the portion of vehicles that we sell is really around identifying the global trade, seeing what our partners are doing, but also at the same time looking at how can we adapt and start transforming our domestic markets to catering for all those conversations.
Thanks very much, Bex, for giving this insight. I'd just like to bring Tobias in here in terms of, the automotive industry is quite important for most countries for things like jobs creation, etc. And in terms of the support by governments around the world, we see, the regulations do provide major changes, but there's also a lot of support in terms of subsidies. I see China, in terms of our survey, has extended the subsidies from 2020 to 22 in terms of helping everyone. But from a South African perspective or governments, where do you think governments can support the automotive industry? In South Africa, we've got a specific program that has been there for supporting the automotive industry going forward. Got a new program starting from next year. But from your perspective, globally, what are you seeing governments doing in terms of supporting or where they're investing to support the automotive industry? You're on mute. You're on mute.
Can you hear me now?
There we go. There we go.
Perfect. I think it's a great question because basically the time horizon is a very important aspect of what we are discussing and have heard also from the other panel attendees. Because basically, I think as far as I have understood the current policies in South Africa, there's quite a clear program up to 2035 in basically increasing the volume of produced cars in South Africa, even doubling it, yeah, but still basically serving export markets, yeah, and I think in that extent you are partially dependent from the OEM strategies of your major OEMs in country who are producing there for local but also for export markets. The key question is what is the and we talked about localization and the end of a global auto market. What is the driving behavior? What are the type of cars the African continent requires 2035 and beyond? And this is basically the long-term path where actually South Africa, but also the African continent, needs to make up their mind if they basically follow either China or Western Europe, or if there are other types of requirements and other types of driving behavior of user patterns which build out kind of a specific local African market and behavior. Yeah? In that sense, I think that perspective is, and that common sense and agreement amongst key stakeholders, how the automotive market and the mobility market shall develop in Africa, is kind of a leading vision which has to be developed first to talk about long-term investments. Because basically, if you have that perspective, you also decide if you invest in fuel cell infrastructure or in electric infrastructure, or if you focus for a longer period on still ICE engines, but basically with a very efficient ICE powertrain and with light materials, etc. So in that sense, asking about the areas of investment, I think still short to medium term, the focus will be on R&D funding for improvements in the ICE efficiency and in light materials and everything what drives CO2 and fuel consumption down. And only medium to long term, the electric powertrain know-how, which will also be part of a fuel cell car. So the electric powertrain will not disappear, is something what has to be built up, but always in conjunction with the renewable energy supply sector. Yeah, because somewhere the energy needs to come from. Yeah, and I think that makes it also so difficult for the policymakers, because you cannot think about battery and energy without thinking about your original renewable sources and the stability of your grid and all that stuff. So short term, still most probably ICE efficiency. Mid to long term, it's important to develop an own vision for the African and South African continent.
Thanks, Tobias. I'm going to get to Renee shortly, but just one quick question from our audience is: do you have a sense of what the global sales, new vehicle sales, is going to be for the second half of 2020 and 2021? Any views? I mean, Renee mentioned the significant decline here in South Africa, and that also linked to. Do you have a view? Do we have a sense of what it's going to look like?
Yeah, maybe difficult to give now a number for this short time frame. Yeah, if we get a second wave in COVID-19, it will hit us again. But I think we are monitoring that very closely. But the consensus we actually see converging, or we are all converging to, is that it will really take until 2023, 2024 to come back to the levels of 2019. So any hope to have a V-shaped recovery on a global level, I think is unrealistic. It might be a little bit faster in China, yeah, but in general, to all players we talk, OEMs, suppliers. Originally, it was only for commercial vehicles that it takes that long, but basically now also for consumer cars, it will take us 4 years to get back to the level we had last year.
Thanks, Tobias. Thanks very much. Maybe a question to Renee. Renee, you know, when you look at the results from the South African respondents, the opportunities in the emerging markets has dropped down to number 6, which personally I find very surprising, considering all the activity happening in other parts of Africa at the moment. What's your thoughts? You spoke about this regional development. I know it's obviously a long-term goal. The opportunities are not necessarily short-term, but at least there's movement in terms of what's happening. Your thoughts on opportunities, if you maybe want to elaborate on that.
Yeah. I mean, it's a fair point, and I'm not surprised by, I suppose, the perceptions of, let's call it, South African executives, and I suppose that spans the breadth of the South African auto space, in that the majority of South African production tends to be anchored or linked to domestic OEM production platforms, and the sales outlook for whatever comes out of those plants, including the African uptake. So for me, the sense that not only have we been decimated locally or in our domestic market by the COVID situation, the appetite for new vehicle product into Africa may not be at the same space that guys may have thought about before. But even without COVID, even pre-COVID, the African market as a whole did not unlock itself in the way that many would have thought. So if people are saying that, listen, the African opportunity is not kind of upfront and center for us right now, it's not surprising. And that comes back to what I said earlier. Those of us that have the role or an ability to influence a different way of looking at Africa, it has got to be on the back of developing industrial networks and partnerships for new product production in a few of the key economies. Not every country can go and develop a new vehicle assembly environment or ecosystem, but it's important to have maybe another 3 or 4 let's call it hubs of vehicle assembly, whether it's in West Africa, East Africa, wherever, and then to have some sort of component regional supply chains built around that. So I think for me, the African one is can only be unlocked on the back of political will, not only in South Africa, but across the African countries. And as we start seeing developments around the common free trade agreement and that kind of stuff, we've got to work really quickly to link that into a formal African industrial autos pact. And I know there's a newly formed association called AAAM, which is doing a lot of good work in the space for component manufacturers, especially in the aftermarket. Our long-term future is linked to this. And I think without driving that industrialization objective, we'll continue talking about Africa as a market that has potential, but is going to struggle to unlock itself.
Thanks, Renee. And another question, maybe in terms of, with COVID-19 and the impact there has in terms of raw material supply and components getting into South Africa due to lockdown of the ports, does that not provide an opportunity for both component manufacturers, OEMs, to reassess their supply? I mean, Tobias mentioned this de-globalization, in the sense, everyone looking at it to see how less reliant they can be on because of the impact of what we see now, but it's happened over the last 2 or 3 years. Do you think there's an opportunity in that space?
Absolutely. I think, and if anything, right now, our component manufacturers are well-based or well-positioned to provide that level of choice in an OEM purchasing chain. And I'm deliberately saying purchasing chain because it's not only OEM localization, it's even at a tier 1 level where there's opportunities as you go further down. And your point is 100% spot on. I've been in several discussions where, again, in that OEM chain perspective, there's discussions on how do we find greater localization to buffer us against the kind of risks that were starting to come about. I can promise you, if the lockdown went on another 2 weeks longer than it did in its hard form or level 5 format earlier this year, there was going to be significant disruption and chaos caused across value chains, not only in South Africa, but in terms of some of the markets that we support. So that idea of finding a greater basket of technologies that can be produced in South Africa is key. The policy environment is changing in that next year, the incentive framework that drives autos production in South Africa, the APDP, is going into its second iteration and is more biased towards localization outcomes. So the time is right. However, we're fully cognizant of the need for, I suppose, some sort of volume maintenance. And localization always becomes tricky when we're trying to say, let's make some gains in localization, but you've got a 30% decline in volumes coming your way. It's always a difficult one. But I think conceptually, we cannot move away from the fact that COVID-19 has shown us to try and buffer our domestic supply chains against some of the struggles that can be achieved from a logistics perspective. Thanks.
Thanks, Renee. Winston, I mean, Dex referred to it earlier about the price of the battery, electric vehicles specifically, and coming to the price. But there's obviously regular changes taking place from a technology point of view. Your thoughts on the changes that are taking place to get those prices down? Because even in our survey, customers are saying that's the number one deterrent, if I can say, in going into buying an electric vehicle is the price. And from what you see, with the demand increasing and the availability of the raw materials for that declining, there's always that economic factor of supply and demand. So is that going to reduce? Your thoughts on the price of electric vehicles and how that's going to be managed going forward?
So the general view is 2022, 2023, sort of the break-even or price parity point that they're talking about for electric vehicles. Now, certainly in South Africa, if they haven't adjusted the tax system, that'll still mean that we pay a penalty, not a penalty in pure cost of the vehicle. So I think that is going to be it'll play a significant role as we go forward with that. Around the technology and the availability of things, I remember debates about 10 years ago around fuel cell technology saying that, platinum is going to be a problem. We're not going to have enough platinum to go into the things. And one point that was made was at that time, the fuel cells were using something like 5% of the platinum that they were using 5 years earlier because of efficiencies in manufacturing processes, etc. So I think that's something we shouldn't underestimate is the technological innovation in still using lithium in a battery, but using it more efficiently and more in a way that it's going to be maybe slightly different form, in a hybridized form, or in some sort of mixed materials, etc. And I think we're going to find and see a lot of those sort of innovations coming in, which are not accounted for when we start talking about supply and demand, or etc. So I think the prices will continue to drop, and we will start to, because we see the competition in the market and how that's happening. Battery prices today are dropping every day. We are literally, if you look at the things that's following Moore's law, and we can debate like we did in the IT industry, that can only happen for a year or two, but we're 30 years down the line and Moore's law still applies to the IT industry. So I think we are going to see a radical change in those things.
No, thanks very much. I think on that note, I don't see any other questions in the chat box. I would like to thank all the panelists, Renee and Winston for joining us this morning, as well as for Tobias for sharing insights on the global survey, and Dex from our mobility team, and everyone that was part of it. Specifically Michelle, who's been in the background organizing everything in terms of sending out invitations and managing it. I think it's been a good, healthy discussion on terms of where we are. I don't think the discussion should end there, because I think, as we mentioned before, there's a lot of parts moving in the space. The industry is dynamic and is changing, and South Africa can't be left on the back foot. So I think the conversations need to continue happening in different formats. But once again, thanks very much to everyone who took part in this webinar. I hope you find the results on the survey, when you go through it in a bit more detail, thought-provoking, if I can put it like that. I really do encourage everyone to engage with it, because it does allow you to look at different scenarios, looking at customer value, product value, etc. You know, what are the mega trends? You know, if you look at the top 3 trends this year, it was battery electric vehicles #1, connectivity #2, and fuel cell #3, whereas last year connectivity was #1. So it's constantly changing. And in South Africa, high on the agenda was fuel cell. From a South African point of view, you know, that was #1 from a South African point of view. So go and look at what the trends are there, engage, give us some feedback. We would appreciate it. And you'll get that, you know, by the end of the day, you'll get the full executive survey. So once again, thanks very much for everyone's participation. And let's keep the conversation talking. Thank you so much. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you. Been really wonderful.
Thank you.